So our group did our presentation on the treatment of Asian Americans in the US military. So me, Heju, Olivia, Hannah, and Shibin. So this is the table of contents. It's the introduction, timeline, veterans, figures, laws, comparison, conclusion, and the bibliography. So the introduction, I'll be talking about a brief summary of the history of Asian Americans in the military and their treatment. So Asian Americans in the military is not a widely considered topic, and which makes it even more important to discuss and provide more information and recognition to the harsh history and improvements and challenges they still face today. So there are currently 52,433 Asian Americans in active duty, 8,854 Asian Americans who are officers, and 43,579 Asian Americans who are enlisted in the Army. And there's also 8,793 Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders who are active in the Army, and more than 20,000 Chinese Americans, along with Koreans and Filipinos in the military. They were in the military for World War II, and considering that there were only 20,000 in the past and 52,000 today, it's I guess a big it's a big increase in improvement in the enlistment of Asian Americans. So Asian Americans have actively participated in the military since the War of 1812, but they were officially drafted in World War II. And there's less racism and discrimination in enlistments and in the Army in general, but that doesn't mean it's it's not completely non-existent. And Asian American service members still face many challenges today. And overall, Asian service members are very underrepresented relative to the US population. But still, Asian Americans have gradually become integrated into the Army as time passed. And the acceptance of Asian Americans in the military is important to support diversity, but also for military strategies too, such as strategic messaging to China.
I'll be giving a run through of the timeline of Asian American involvement in the United States military. Little is known about Asian American military service prior to the 20th century, but we can trace the relative beginning of this involvement to 1812, during which Filipino soldiers fought in the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was a conflict between America and Great Britain over British violations of U.S. maritime rights. And in 1815, President Andrew Jackson's notes mentioned that Filipino soldiers had fought alongside him in the Battle of New Orleans, which was on January 8th, 1815, during the War of 1812. And America was able to secure their largest land victory of the War of 1812 at the Battle of New Orleans. Okay, so the build-up to World War I, the next, I guess, notable war in which Asian Americans served in the military, includes some important developments. I wasn't able to condense all the important developments in here, and I had to choose the ones that had like the greatest impact, not necessarily, but you know what I mean. So yeah. In 1843, the first Japanese immigrants arrived in America beginning May 7th, 1843. And then the Transcontinental Railroad was completed on May 10th, 1869 by predominantly Chinese laborers. And not necessarily about the military, but the month of May was chosen for Asian American Pacific Islander Month because it marks the anniversary of the arrival of the first Japanese immigrants, May 7th, 1843, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, May 10th, 1869. Okay, and now we move on to World War I, which began in 1914 and lasted till 1918. During World War I, there was a wave of thousands of Asian Americans joining the U.S. military to serve, though the exact number is unknown. Draft posters and ads for war bonds were printed en masse in Mandarin, Japanese, Korean, and Tagalog. And this media was meant to remind Asian Americans of their responsibility to enroll in the military, and it was effective. After the war, Asian American soldiers were recognized for their contributions to the war effort and were subsequently allowed to become naturalized citizens. By the end of the war, there was a staggering 180,000 Asian Americans residing in the United States, including approximately 100,000 Japanese Americans, 60,000 Chinese Americans, and 5,000 Filipino Americans. Okay, and then several years later, World War II comes around. It began in 1939 and lasted till 1945. The start of World War II saw more than 250,000 Asian Americans living in America. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in 1941, Japanese Americans were perceived as a threat to national security. And this led to President Franklin D. Roosevelt's creation of the War Relocation Authority in March 1942. And thousands of Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated to internment camps set up across the nation. Despite being heavily discriminated against, many Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, wanted to volunteer to serve in the U.S. Army and serve their country. Activated on February 1st, 1943, the 422nd Regimental Combat Team, an army consisting almost solely of Nisei, was created. And today, this infantry unit is remembered for their brave actions in World War II and is one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. And there were also congressional resolutions to allow unlimited enlistment of Filipino Americans in the war, beginning in December 1941. Okay, so finally, I'm going to discuss post-World War II. From 1950 to 1953, we have the Korean War, which was an armed conflict fought on the Korean Peninsula between North Korea and South Korea and their respective allies. The United States was allied with South Korea. After World War II, the Department of the Army dropped the designation Asian American, so approximate numbers are not provided for this war. However, the Japanese American Historical Society has made an estimation that 5,000 Nisei served in Korea in the U.S. Army. Additionally, there were a number of units that remained predominantly Asian American, like the 100th Battalion, 442nd Infantry, and 5th Regimental Combat Team. And also, Korean Americans began to serve more visibly in the military, and their contributions were recognized as the war highlighted their role. Okay, and last but not least, we have the Vietnam War, which was 1955 to 1975. And the Vietnam War was one of the first experiences in which Asian Americans served alongside non-Asian members on a larger scale. So similar to wars before, some Asian Americans felt that it was a part of their duty to enlist in the army and contribute to the military. Approximately 35,000 Asian Americans served in the U.S. military during the Vietnam War, marking yet another milestone in this timeline of Asian American military involvement.
Now we're going to be talking about sort of veterans, important events or acts related to Asian American War veterans, and just general experiences and treatments of veterans. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is the Nye Lee Bill, which granted citizenship to many Issei, which are first generation Japanese American immigrants who fought during World War II. And so this was like a really big deal because it allowed these Japanese Americans for the first time to be like an American citizen. And while obviously there was still many battles to be fought in terms of like Asian American treatment in the future, this was kind of like one of the biggest like first steps in doing so. And then the S1050, which was an act to award a Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the Chinese American veterans of World War II. And so basically, this recognized their service during World War II. And this was also a really big deal just because it was like kind of a really big acknowledgement, like a really huge sort of award and medal to give. And it kind of just acknowledged the fact that Chinese Americans were and deeply influenced and deeply helped the American military, and that their sort of involvement in the military was important and impactful, and that they weren't just, random people who were like onto the side. They were like a crucial part of the fight, and they were, just the same as any other like American citizen. And so the third thing is the passage of the Indochina Migration and Refugee Act and also the US Refugee Act. And so Hmong and Montagnards fought in Laos and Vietnam, assisting US war efforts. But after the war, they faced many challenges into just like going back like into society and just like being treated the way that they should have had. And so many refugees became refugee. Many of these veterans became refugees after the U.S. withdrew from Southeast Asia. And so the passage of these acts allowed for the resettlement of some refugees, but they did not automatically grant citizenship. And also, Hmong veterans did not benefit from this veteran status until the passage of the Hmong Veterans Naturalization Act of 2000, which, when you think about it, that's less than 25 years ago. So while obviously there were many, important acts and that they did, be able to like give better treatment to Asian American veterans for the service that they did put into the American military, there's still a long way to still go with that. And they weren't just, completely allowed to like get citizenship, and that was sort of like the end of the discussion. There's still like a lot more challenges. Finally, we're just going to generally talk about other types of support. So I think it's pretty clear that many Asian Americans who fought during the Vietnam War faced a lot of race-related trauma, such as like racial stigmatization and societal stereotypes. And so because of this, according to the Veterans Health Administration, VHA, AA and HPI veterans are more likely to have higher levels of education, income, and use of private insurance, but they have poor mental health and reported lesser use of veteran and non-veteran mental health resources. And this is like sort of important because even though like from the outside it may seem like Asian Americans like don't need the help, but they're surviving and that they're being successful, in reality and in a lot of cases, their mental health and sort of like them coming back to society, it was like there's still a lot that they had to like deal with and a lot of trauma that they weren't just allowed to sort of deal with because of the stigmatization of the fact that they were Asian American and they were essentially like fighting in wars like the Vietnam War. And so also these veterans they report facing less support and being treated with less respect than white veterans. And the Office of Health Equity, OHE, despite all this, provides support for these veterans who might be facing cultural differences. And a really great example of one of them is rural ANHPI or rural Pacific Islander veterans may face more PTSD and difficulties in their day-to-day life. And that's just because they live in these rural areas and they might not have as much access to support. And so the United States Department of Veteran Affairs, VA, they basically provided cognitive behavioral clinical intervention specific for these rural Pacific Islander veterans. And so this intervention is called KOIA, and it integrates Pacific Islander values with US intervention. So it's kind of like a mix and really takes into the account of like the Pacific Islander culture and ideas and sort of mixes it with the US intervention. And it overall sort of helped the veterans and their families and sort of represented the importance of creating specific mental health support for each subgroup of veterans and their families. And so this is really important because I think a lot of times Asian Americans and ANHPIs are kind of like forced into this one single category, and they're sort of like expected to all like have the same challenges or the same benefits, when in reality each ethnicity and each group underneath that label faces its own distinct set of challenges and difficulties. And sort of when you need to sort of remember that, and that's why interventions like these, like Koya, was really impactful because they really sort of directly targeted a specific group of people, integrated their cultural values and traditions, and overall just really helped them in a way that just using regular US intervention could. And so these are just sort of generally like some of the most important acts or sort of supports that Asian American veterans were given. And and when we sort of think about, and I think that that's important to acknowledge because it might not be like everyday uh, things that we know. It might not be like taught in schools a lot of time. And so I think it's important to acknowledge both the discrimination that a NHPI veterans have gone through, but also the ways that we are still trying to make that better. And so, like, as we go on into this presentation, we're going to sort of move on to more of the accomplishments of a NHPIs, because not everything, is really sad, and that we should really celebrate, a NHPI sort of accomplishments in a field that we might not know a lot about.
I'm Heju, and I'm going to be talking about the significant Asian American figures that were in the US military. So the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was a team made entirely of Japanese Americans, or Nisei. At a time such as World War II, when Japanese intern camps and racism against Asian Americans as a whole grew, these people fought hard for their country, achieving the title of most decorated unit in the military for the size and length of service in all of US history. They also invented the phrase "go for broke," a gambling term coined in Hawaii that meant a player was risking it all in the hopes of winning big. Also to mention, there was another infantry at that time by the name of the 100 Infantry Battalion that was also entirely Japanese American and left a mark overseas. Colonel Young-Oh Kim was especially known for leading said 100th Battalion overseas in Europe in victory against many battles by tenaciously training the soldiers using unorthodox methods. When he wanted to enlist in the army due to racism in the system, he could not enter or enlist until the draft was made applicable to Asian Americans. When he was sent to the 100th Battalion, he was offered a transfer to another one due to Japanese and Koreans not getting along due to Japan's past annexation of Korea, but he refused. There are no Japanese or Koreans here. We're all Americans and we're all fighting for the same cause. He stayed because he knew that in another battalion, he would never get to a leadership role because of racism. Now was the time. When he arrived at the 100th Battalion, he thought that the crew was disorganized. They weren't fond of him either, calling him G.I. Kim. They hadn't been sent out yet and had been just training in camps for months on end. In the end, he realized their hidden potential and started training them. He would use aggressive and unorthodox tactics to train them, such as placing them in a variety of specific situations, such as whip swatching the higher up and lower ups positions around so that both could have practice giving out commands. And it worked. It got them ready for battle, because battle is a really hectic place where a lot of unexpected things can happen. The 100th Battalion was in so many of the bloodiest battles overseas that they were even nicknamed the Purple Heart Battalion. After World War II, Young-Oh Kim opened a self-service laundromat and earned 5 times more than the army paid him. Then the Korean War started and he went off into the front lines again. He led his battalion into victory again, but he got seriously injured during a friendly fire incident. Later on, when he recovered, he pretended not to know Korean so that he could fight, because Koreans back then were being used for the Korean War to translate. But his knowledge of the language helped him be both an intelligence and operations officer. After the Korean War, he retired, studied history in college, and then he started many projects to help the Asian American community. Kim died of cancer in 2005. Nieves Fernandez. Nieves Fernandez was born in 1906, and she was a Filipino guerrilla leader in Tacloban City during World War II. When the Japanese began occupying the Philippine Islands for resources, including her hometown of Tacloban, Fernandez organized a resistance movement that numbered around 110 guerrilla fighters. Nieves then waged an unconventional war against the Japanese throughout their occupation. She earned the name Captain Fernandez and the silent killer due to her exploits. She trained her men vigorously in manufacturing weapons and conducting ambushes. Before the war, actually, Fernandez was a school teacher and an entrepreneur. And it's crazy how fast things changed during a time of pressure. Eric K. Shinseki. Shinseki Ken was born in Hawaii on November 28, 1942, to parents of Japanese descent who had immigrated to Hawaii to work the sugarcane plantations like many other Japanese families. He was inspired to join the military when he was young by his uncles, who had also gone to the military. He was in the Boy Scouts when he was young, which taught him leadership, and he was very educated, having attended a number of colleges and gotten a number of degrees. He went on to do 2 tours of the Vietnam War, which he got part of his foot blown off by a landmine, and won 3 Bronze Star medals with 2 Purple Hearts. As of 2009, Shinseki was the highest-ranked Asian American in the entirety of the history of the United States. He was the Army's Chief of Staff, then turned Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Shinseki resigned in 2014 due to a large scandal concerning the treatment of veterans in veterans hospitals in a certain program which he had a part in running. A former veteran described the case as a very, very good man who's run up against some pretty terrible problems with his job. Shinseki has a wife named Patricia, Patty for short, 2 children, Lori and Ken, and 7 grandchildren. Hazel Lee and Maggie Yee. Hazel Lee and Maggie Yee were Chinese American women who thwarted prejudice and preconception to become World War II pilots in the US military, aka they were both in the WASP program as flyers. Both were mistaken as the Japanese enemy as a couple times, and they both felt like the odd one out because they were both the only Asian American women in the service. Hazel Lee joined the WASPs first, and Maggie Yee joined a little while later in the same year. Both of them were enamored by flight at a young age. One of them lived near a flight compound, and that's where Amelia Earhart worked. Maggie Yee lived near an airport where Amelia Earhart would occasionally take off, and during one of the takeoffs, Maggie Yee waved to Amelia Earhart, and Amelia Earhart waved back. Maggie Yee was there when the WASPs were finally acknowledged to be veterans and received the Congressional Gold Medal. However, Lee died as her airplane collided with another aircraft on Thanksgiving Day, 1944. She was the last WASP to perish in the line of duty. Susan Ann Cuddy was born in 1915 in Los Angeles, California. She was the 3rd child and the eldest daughter of An Chang-ho and Helen Lee, who were the first Korean couple to move to the United States. She was the first female aerial gunnery officer in the United States military. She later became a lieutenant and was in charge of 300 agents in Russia, and she also helped train many other military officers. And she did work on many top secret projects for the Department of Defense and a lot of other places during her service in the United States military. And lastly, She defied a lot of odds by marrying someone that was not Asian, Frank Cuddy, and she was named Woman of the Year in 2003.
So now I'll be doing a comparison between the treatment of Asian Americans in the past and now in like the military. So Asian Americans have had a long-standing history of facing discrimination in the military that like still continues today. And while the scale of the discrimination has gotten relatively smaller, the fact that they still are facing racism today like stresses the need for more fair treatment in the military. The history of mistreatment. So in the Civil War, the 1850 Census Act was one of the laws that like discriminated against Asian Americans. So depending on the enumerator that was collecting data, they were either marked as white or mulatto and was even left blank at certain times. And this meant that they often served in varying units. And this impacted the benefits from serving in the military because those who were classified in the United States colored troops were paid at a reduced rate. And the Geary Act of 1892 was an extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act that had new requirements for Asian Americans. And after the passage of the Geary Act in 1892, all Asian American service members, including those who had served in white regiments, still had to apply for citizenship and pension authorization, and which meant that Asian Americans were stripped from citizen benefits. And in World War II, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt invoked the Alien Enemies Act to deem Japanese Americans and those of Japanese descent as enemy aliens, and this shifted the focus of Asian American status in the military from race and citizenship towards loyalty, patriotism, and belonging. And in the Vietnam War used selective training and the Service Act of 1940, which made no reference to race or color, but many Asian Americans faced discrimination and trauma as the United States fought another Asian enemy. And during training, Asian Americans were often used as a reference for enemy profiles. So discrimination in World War II, which was the first war that Asian Americans were officially drafted in. So Japanese Americans faced mistreatment in internship camps, but they still fought bravely as soldiers in World War II. Even after they like struggled with citizenship benefits, Filipino Americans also fought alongside Japanese Americans and like Korean Americans and like other Asian Americans in the war, but they were also like stripped of citizenship and like other rights post World War II. The Rescission Act of 1946, it said that Filipino soldiers who have been promised citizenship shall not be deemed to be or to have been service in the military or national forces of the United States or any component thereof or any law of the United States conferring rights, privileges, or benefits. So decades later, the government actually like reversed this policy through the passages of the Immigration Act of 1990, the Veterans Healthcare, Capital Asset and Business Improvement Act, and other laws and like acts and like organizations. But like it still meant that like Asian Americans in general who still fought like in the war for the United States, like often like struggled to like get the benefits of like being veterans of those like wars. So in a 2017 survey, it said that 25% of Asian American service members experienced racial or ethnic harassment or discrimination in the military. The spread of COVID-19 like made in general like violent attacks against Asian Americans to increase. But like even before COVID, like Asian American members like still reported to have like higher levels of racial harassment and discrimination compared to like white service members. And the exclusion of Asian Americans like now takes a more nuanced form, which means like unconscious bias as they are treated as perpetual foreigners. And this compares to like the historic exclusion of Asian Americans that took the form of law and policy, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act or detention camps in World War II.
So I think I just wanted to sort of conclude on the thoughts of the presentation. I think that overall, Asian Americans have obviously played a very large role in the military and have really been just as much of, and it's unfortunate that's not necessarily always reflected in the way that they're treated. Even now in the present, with the impacts of COVID, there's still so much more we can do with it, with, you know, sort of increasing the positive treatment towards API in the military, veterans, and also just in accomplishments and the good things that have military. I think that it's definitely a sort of mixed bag, and that, you know, it's very important to sort of have like a very complex overview of the situation and really, you know, sort of recognize that and recognize sort of what we can do in the future to help make the treatment of APIs better, but also, you know, sort of the accomplishments that have already occurred. And so, yeah. On the next slide is our bibliography with all of our sources, and that's our presentation.